Welcome back to the 7th Generation Podcast and Dr. B Teaches. I hope everyone is doing well out there. I'm back with another episode, and today we're going to be diving into what's been taking place in Southern California with these wildfires. It's devastating communities all over SoCal, and I want to talk about that more from a Native American point of view. But before we get into that, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge an important historical event. This year, this day, January 17th, marks 132 years since the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And this is a major tragedy. And I just want to say that myself and all of us should stand in solidarity with our Native Hawaiian relatives whose sovereignty and cultural practices were violently stripped away on this day 132 years ago. We're talking about the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, the overthrow of their queen, which involved the illegal invasion by the United States into the Hawaiian Kingdom, and of course the takeover. And as a result, they've been dealing with settler colonial policies that have devastated not just the environment there, but also has had extreme consequences on the culture and the people of Hawaii. So to all of you, our relatives in Hawaii, we stand in solidarity with you. Their ongoing struggle for justice and self-determination is certainly deeply connected to the broader fight, that broader struggle for Indigenous rights and the Landback movement, which we're going to talk about today. And we're going to connect the Landback movement to what's happening in Southern California while these wildfires just rage and destroy thousands and thousands of acres and homes. In fact, over 15,000 acres have been destroyed by these wildfires in Southern California, along with over 10,000 homes. These fires are just another example of just how destructive the legacy of settler colonialism has been on the ecosystems, not just in California, but really throughout North America. And it has left these environments incredibly vulnerable. And of course, modern society with all its technology is ill-equipped to withstand these climate-related disasters. So let's start with a little bit of California history. The indigenous population, indigenous communities have been here since time immemorial. Thousands of years, indigenous communities lived and thrived throughout what we call California. And of course, the Spanish arrived here in 1492. They arrived in the Caribbean and eventually spread out from there, including arriving in what we call Mexico today in, I believe, 1519. Eventually, they make their way to the Southwest in what we call California. The mission system is established in 1776. Junipero Serra is the one who leads this program to colonize the area, to Christianize Native Americans and bring them into the Catholic Church. And this devastates Native American culture in California. But not only is the land colonized by these invaders, it's also colonized by the plants and the animals that they bring here as well. And of course, the California landscape today that we see is dramatically different than what we would see prior to the advent of colonialism and then these settler colonial policies that continue to devastate the land. And so it looks a lot different today than it once did. And so Native Americans had a really beautiful relationship with the land, one that was built on reciprocity, one that was built on an equal relationship where plants and animals and human beings live together in a type of relationship that was reflective of reciprocity as opposed to exploitation. And all of this changes with the advent of these settler colonial policies. The Spanish eventually lose their hold on this area that today we call Mexico, which included California at the time, included the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. This was all now considered to be Mexico. But just like it didn't belong to the Spanish, it didn't belong to the Mexicans as well, because the rightful owners were always the indigenous communities who had been here since the beginning of time. But during the gold rush, you have a new group of settlers, colonizers, who come out this way, and then you see the start of the Mexican-American War, which results in the American takeover of what we call California. However, I always remind people that this was never truly Spain, just like it was never truly Mexico. The rightful owners were always the indigenous communities, the autonomous, sovereign indigenous communities who had been here, who had nurtured the landscape, who had been living on this land, again, since the beginning of time. So after the Mexican-American War comes to an end, one of the first laws that are passed here in California by the legislature is the 1850 Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. Now, this law had nothing to do with protecting Native communities. It had everything to do with settler violence and genocide. In fact, it actually encouraged the enslavement of California natives. And I always tell people one of the worst genocides that is unknown to most people is the genocide of California natives here during the gold rush, when literally tens of thousands of Native Americans are murdered during this time where Europeans are flooding in search of wealth and in search of land. It's pretty much the story of settler colonialism, but here in California it was particularly brutal. But as part of this law, California politicians also banned the use of fire by Native communities. So indigenous communities here, not just in California, but throughout North America, utilize cultural burns, which is a practice that was central to the indigenous land stewardship. So for thousands of years, California Native people would use fire as a tool to manage their ecosystems. So cultural burns would help improve the health of the soil. It would control pests and bugs. It encouraged the germination of seeds and promoted the growth of native plants. This practice helped maintain balance and these thriving ecosystems that supported indigenous communities all throughout, not just California, but throughout North America. So the use of fire is incredibly important to the land management skills and techniques and strategies of indigenous communities, especially here in California. But these settler colonial policies, including this 1850 law, change everything. So the land is not only confiscated, Native Americans are forced onto reservations here in California. They're forced onto what they call rancherias, and indigenous practices are outlawed, including this land management technique that indigenous communities have been utilizing forever. So instead of reciprocal relationships with the land, settlers prioritized exploitation, extraction of wealth, leaving these ecosystems neglected and vulnerable. And this is the whole story of settler colonialism, a very, very important one as well. So it's not just the conquering of people, it's also the destruction of these landscapes. So today we're seeing the consequences of this mismanagement in the form of these massive wildfires that destroy thousands of acres and homes, not just here in California, not just what you see in Southern California, but what you're seeing really all over these settler colonial areas where indigenous people have been removed from the land, where the mismanagement of these territories, because now the land has become just a mere resource, a thing, a commodity. And when you commodify something and you leave behind those reciprocal relationships, that's where exploitation comes into play. And according to the latest statistics with these fires in Southern California, over 15,000 acres have been burned. Over 10,000 structures have been destroyed. People have died in these fires, and countless families have been displaced. So even in the wealthiest country in the world, a country that has more resources, more technology than anywhere else, is ill-equipped to prevent these disasters. And when these disasters happen, they're ill-equipped to even begin to handle them. And that speaks volumes about just how horrible climate change is and just how problematic these settler colonial policies have been, not just on indigenous communities, the removal of them from their homelands, but also on these ecosystems as well. So let's talk a little bit about settler colonialism and capitalism, because these are two inherently exploitive systems. They go hand in hand. They're designed to extract as much wealth as possible from the land for settlers without any regard for sustainability or balance with these ecosystems that we all rely on for survival. I mean, we live in a very delicate biosphere. That biosphere gives us life. But when it comes to settler colonial policies and capitalism, that's completely disregarded. The whole point is the pursuit of wealth. So in a capitalistic society, it's about producing capital. It's about producing wealth. But mostly for those in power and for those who control the financial institutions, the financial structures that run this global system that we call capitalism. And of course, the concentration of wealth at the top of these societies comes always at the expense of indigenous communities and of course these ecosystems as well. Wealth is always produced for those in power, reinforcing these systems of inequality, perpetuating the exploitation of natural resources. And then this mindset has led to deforestation, overgrazing, the destruction of ecosystems all over the globe for the purpose of building wealth. And so you see a major disruption in the natural life cycles, leaving the land in a state of crisis. But there is hope. And that hope lies in the knowledge of indigenous communities and the Landback movement. I know there is a lot of confusion about what exactly is the Landback movement, and I'm going to try to break it down in the most basic terms. So the Landback movement seeks to return stewardship of indigenous territories back to indigenous peoples who've lived on the land since time immemorial, whose traditional knowledge and practices are vital to restoring the balance to these ecosystems. So it's about utilizing the indigenous knowledge that Native communities all across Turtle Island have been collecting and gathering since time immemorial. And this traditional ecological knowledge has allowed tribal communities to exist in these areas, to thrive, in fact, and to have a relationship with the land that is reciprocal. But because of settler colonialism, because of capitalism, we've seen a break, a rupture in the relationship between human beings and these ecosystems. So where Native people exist, where Native people have some type of sovereignty and autonomy and the ability to manage their lands, we notice that biodiversity tends to thrive. And so the Landback movement is about bringing back the traditional knowledge that created balance between human beings and these ecosystems. And you don't have to be a scientist, you don't have to be a biologist to know that our ecosystems are all in danger. Indigenous communities have always lived in reciprocity with the land. They understand that caring for the Earth's resources is essential for their long-term survival. Not like a short-term system like capitalism, which cares only about capital, about generating wealth, not about the welfare of people, certainly not the welfare of our resources that are essential for our own survival. So it's not just about human beings being able to thrive and to live and to raise their families in a good way. It's also about other life forms as well. It's about developing reciprocal relationships, healthy relationships with our ecosystems, so that we could all live in balance, so that human beings can have the things that they need, food and shelter, the resources needed to survive, to be able to thrive, and that other life forms that exist in the biosphere that are also important for our well-being are able to thrive as well. So the Landback movement and restoring indigenous cultural practices like these cultural burns is not just about preventing wildfires, it's about reestablishing a healthy relationship with the land. And when we're in balance with the earth, we can address some of the root causes of climate change rather than simply reacting to it or reacting to the symptoms, which are these wildfires that are completely out of control and costing us billions and billions of dollars and creating just so much damage and so much trauma in people's lives. So the Landback movement isn't about kicking people out of their houses. It's not about removing people from the land. It's about living in balance with the land. And that traditional ecological knowledge that indigenous communities acquired throughout the thousands of years of living on these territories is essential to the well-being of all of our survival throughout the globe. So these cultural burns, guided by all that traditional ecological knowledge that indigenous communities have been accumulating for thousands of years, will have a positive impact on these ecosystems that have all been put in peril because of settler colonial policies. And basically that's what's happened since Native Americans have been pushed off their land and forced onto reservations or rancherias, is that you've seen just settler colonial policy after policy that has led to the mismanagement of these really delicate ecosystems. And not only that, these indigenous cultural practices also support wildlife habitats. They promote richer soil and help native plant species flourish as well. So let's take a moment to imagine what this would look like on a larger scale. If the land were returned to indigenous stewardship, we could see a dramatic shift in the way that we approach the climate crisis. In fact, I'm going to argue that without traditional ecological knowledge that indigenous communities have been acquiring for hundreds and hundreds of years, we are doomed. And it's not just going to affect us here today, it's going to affect our children and our grandchildren. So instead of exploiting the biosphere for profit, which capitalism is incredibly good at doing, we could nurture it for the well-being of everybody. And I'm not just talking about human beings, I'm also talking about the winged, the four-legged, the bugs, the creepy crawlers, all life forms. And this is not just a theoretical idea, because where you see indigenous communities still have control over their homelands and their ecosystems, you also see a healthy relationship between those communities and their ecosystems, which means that their biodiversity is in place, it's intact, it's not being exploited. These devastating wildfires that we're witnessing in January, in the winter of all times of the year, are a scary reminder that the current system is failing us all. So climate change, fueled by centuries of exploitation of indigenous peoples, of the land, the neglect, is creating a world where extreme weather patterns are the norm now. These extreme events, these wildfires, are now not just unusual events. We're just seeing this all over, and this is incredibly problematic. And so if we want to ensure a livable future, which is something that I know all of us want, not just for ourselves, but also for our children and the generations to come, we need to rethink our relationship to the land. And this means confronting the legacy of settler colonialism, the policies that come with it, and capitalism as a whole. It means supporting the Landback movement as well, which aims to heal both the land and the people who have been most harmed by this exploitation. So we should all be in support of the Landback movement, not just us as Indigenous people, but everybody should be in support of putting the land back in the hands of those who are best suited to be able to handle these ecosystems. And of course, we're talking about the Indigenous communities who've developed these reciprocal relationships since the beginning of time. In closing, I want to leave you with this thought. Before colonization, fire was a vital part of the care and the stewardship of the land. It was a tool that promoted life, not destruction. Today, we see fire as a threat because we've lost that balance with the earth. But it doesn't have to be that way. By listening to and learning from our Indigenous ancestors, Indigenous communities, we can restore the balance. And I believe that without traditional Indigenous ecological knowledge, we are in trouble. So we can build a future where our ecosystems are resilient, our lands are healthy, and our relationship to the earth are based on respect and reciprocity. And that's the way that it always was, and that's the way that it needs to be for us to have some kind of future. All right, thank you for joining Dr. B Teaches and the 7th Generation podcast. And as always, I'm really interested in having you share your thoughts in the comment section. As always, you can follow me on Instagram. Just search 7th Gen Podcast. You can find this podcast, the 7th Generation Podcast, on all major platforms. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, Dr. B Teaches. And as long as TikTok is up, I'm also on TikTok. Just search Merciless Savages. I'm Dr. B. I hope today's conversation has given some of you, all of you, something to think about. And of course, if you would like to support the Landback movement or learn more about Indigenous practices, definitely do your homework. Indigenous peoples have lived on the land since the beginning of time and are the ones who are best suited to care for these ecosystems. And so there is so much that we can learn from our ancestors, and our knowledge, the practices that our people had in place allowed us to live in peace, to be able to thrive in some of the most difficult, harshest climates around the earth. And that is something that is truly amazing. And here in this modern world that we live in, this crazy schizophrenic world that we live in, this knowledge is still applicable. So let's continue to stand together in the fight for a sustainable future. It's not just about us. It's not just about our kids. It's about the 7th generation coming. Until next time, and remember, do your best to always live in balance. I'm Dr. B from Dr. B Teaches and the 7th Generation Podcast. I'll see you all real soon.